I am truly thankful to be here this afternoon. Grateful for the privilege of being able to talk about this topic. When Brother BJ called me, he said, Brother, I'd like for you to talk about how to love your children and your grandchildren. That just thrilled me to death. I don't know. Let's see. I'm looking behind you. Brother Keith Mosier used to come and hold gospel meetings there at Bobby Branch, and he'd come in and he'd reach back for his billfold, and he says, I want to see your grandkids. I want to show you my grandkids. Well, you get to see my granddaughter. I've got one, and this is a picture I love of her. She's about 10 years older than this picture now. She's just fixing to start driving. She's going to be 16 in about a couple of months. A real sweet young lady, and I am just thrilled to talk about teaching the nations to love your children and your grandchildren. As we begin, I think it's valuable for us to realize that every grandparent, who is what they ought to be, is thrilled with pride to be able to talk about their grandchildren, and most of us are thrilled to talk about our children as well. In Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 6, Solomon said, "Children's children are the crown of old men." I think I qualify. My hair is wide enough to say, and I am just thrilled to talk about and to reflect upon those who are grandchildren. Beautiful statement found in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 23. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up at Joseph's knees. You think about just the beauty of that idea, being brought up on their knees. My wife's father, Benny Bristow, was a preacher for many years. Would come to our house when our boys were little, and he'd cross his legs and he'd put the boy on his ankle and he'd bounce him up and down. He said, that's the picture that comes to my mind when I think about being brought up at Joseph's knees. In Job 42, verse 16, after Job had experienced so much sadness in his life, you get to the end of the book and Job describes for us how blessed he was, and he says he lived 140 years after that and saw his sons, his sons' sons, even 4 generations. You think about the grandeur of being able to have 4 generations. And then Psalm 128. As you read that wonderful chapter about how blessed God's people were, he gives a picture there of being like a fruitful vine by the sides of thine house, children like olive plants about the table. And then you get to verse 6, yea, thou shalt see thy children's children, and peace upon Israel. It is a blessing if you have children and you have grandchildren, and you think about the blessing that involves. But you see, our world doesn't have all of that. In fact, our world in many places do not reflect a real love for their children and grandchildren. For many years, my wife was a social worker working for the Tennessee Department of Children's Services. And I can tell you, she would cry over some of the children that were abused and were neglected. Not only abused and neglected by their parents, but even the grandparents treated them as if they were problems rather than a blessing in their life. You see, our world really does need to know about that. And then there are people who fail to provide for their future for their children and grandchildren. I know most of us think about people who are failing to train their children, for instance, to be able to provide for themselves. Last evening, Brother Miller described for us socialism and how it's infecting our society today, and how children are being reared to be growing up and feeling this entitlement. Someone has to provide for me. Failure to teach them to work. But even much more serious is the failure to provide for their spiritual success. There was a time when during the summer months, and it was Vacation Bible School, People from the community would rally around, bring their children to Vacation Bible School, be a part of all that. And yet, today, children have so many other things that are attracting their attention, and parents are letting them, to the point where we live in a society where children need to be trained in spiritual matters. Now, if you look at the book, and some of you do, whenever I come and I listen to someone else lecture, I go to the lectureship book, and the first thing I do is look at the outline and I'm able to follow through. And if that's what you're expecting this afternoon, you're going to miss it. Because I had a very short time to get my manuscript in, and then after I turned it in, I thought, I can do a lot better than that. So what I'm going to present this afternoon is not what's in the lectureship book. I want to talk about being in love with your children and grandchildren. And I'm going to talk about being intentional in that, to instruct, to instill, to inspire. And if you'll let me change the second letter of that last one, instead of I-M to I-N, you'll see what I mean, talking about being in love. So for just a few minutes, let's talk about a few of these things. And first of all, let's talk about being intentional. The old phrase is, if you don't know where you're going, you'll never know it when you arrive. How many people have ever gotten into a vehicle and they started driving and they'd say, where are we going? I don't know. When are we going to get there? I don't know when we're going to get there. Do you know how many people rear their children like that? They have absolutely no idea where they're going, have no intent of where they intend to arrive. You see, being intentional means to act deliberately, on purpose, having a plan in mind. If you read Solomon in Proverbs 22, verse 6, most of you can quote this very well. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Interesting, if you look at that word train, it's from the same word to dedicate. Like when Solomon dedicated the temple to the Lord, that's that word. The idea of commitment to, we as parents should realize that we have an intent to try to train and provide for our children guidance and direction. Of course, the New Testament passage in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, where Paul writes, and ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Those words, bring them up, are literally the idea to nourish, to be able to provide for them food. Now, how many of us would think about our lives and our children and to say, are my children going to have food to eat tonight? Are they going to have clothes to wear? What kind of job am I going to have to provide for my children? And will I be able to provide something in the future for my grandchildren? There has to be some thought, some intent behind this. In Psalm 34, verse 11, and I will tell you, if you are taking notes, Psalm 34 is a beautiful psalm to study, and he says, come, ye children, hearken unto me, I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about discipline today. That's sort of where we'll end. But I can tell you what, I am really thankful I had parents to teach me the fear of the Lord. They taught me to fear them first as an authority. But once as a parents teach you to fear them, then you also fear the law, you also fear your teachers, and you fear the Lord. And that begins very early in life and intent. I think what this does, this forces us to ask ourselves some very serious questions. And I wanted this to be as practical as possible when you start asking some serious questions. And the first one is, what do you want for your children and your grandchildren? Now, I know what a lot of people are wanting. They want their kids to be popular. They want them to be accepted. They want them to fit in with everybody else in society. And for that reason, because that's what they want for them, they provide for that. But I'd like to ask this audience here, for those of you who have children and grandchildren, what do you really want for your grandchildren? Second question that goes along with that is, what will it take to accomplish that? What will it require on my part as a grandfather, as a father, to be able to meet the needs? Now, if I'm talking about intent, I've got to think about some of those things, because you have to ask the question, if that's true, when should I start? You should have started already. It's the old question, Brother Rutherford did mention, but I'm supposed to be retired in 2 months. Do you know when you're supposed to start thinking about retirement? When you start working. And when do you start thinking about being a parent or being a grandparent? Well, let me suggest to you to be a Manoah. Not a lot of people think about Manoah. But if you don't know who he is, he, along with his dear wife, were wanting a child. And the angel of the Lord appeared to them and said, "You're going to have a child. And this is going to be what he's going to be. I don't want you to eat anything of the grape. You're not going to put a razor on his head because he's going to be a Nazarite from birth." Well, I want you to listen to what we read in Judges 13, verse 8. Then Manoah entreated the Lord and said, "O my Lord, let the man of God which thou didst send come again to us, and teach us what we shall do unto the child that shall be born." You know when he was interested in what to do for that child? It's before the child was ever born. You go a little bit further to verse 12, and Manoah said to the angel this time in prayer, "Now let thy words come to pass. How shall we order the child, and how shall we do unto him? What should we do? We want to know what we should do." Aren't you thankful that God in His mercy and His providence provided His word for us so that we've got a guide to be intentional, to know what to do? Let's be a Manoah. Let's be intentional as we try to provide for our children. But if I love my children and I love my grandchildren, I'm also going to instruct. You see, I need to tell my children and my grandchildren about what God has done and what God expects of each of us. As Moses had led the children of Israel on that 40-year wilderness wandering, they came to the east side of the Jordan River to the land of Moab. And there's now a new generation of people, because most of the ones who had come out of Egypt had died in the wilderness. And so Moses is going to give a restatement of God's plan for them. And now he is providing this new generation their guidance and direction as they prepare to march over into the promised land. And he said to them in chapter 6, verses 6 through 9, "And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently to thy children. And thou shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thy house, when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them as a sign upon thy hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thy eyes. And thou shalt write them on the post of thy house and on thy gates." Notice how he phrases this. It's not to suggest that organized, planned classes are not beneficial. They are. But he says, the way I want you to teach your children is when you talk of them when you sit in your house, when you go to bed, when you rise up. In other words, it should be a part of your daily instruction. Now, I'm going to tell you, I had a grandfather who served as an elder at the Bethel Church of Christ in Vernon, Alabama for many, many years. Really all of my memory of my life. Great man. And we called him Papa Lyman. And full of wisdom. But you know what the wisdom he had was always, I'm going to quote you something from the Bible. Of course, my kids make fun of me because that's what I did. If it was time for them to get a bath, I'd say, "You've got the Lazarus disease. Behold, he stinketh." And I'd say, "You got to," and so everything in my house, just about, had to have a scripture attached to it. And my boys still make fun of me because of that. But you see, it becomes integrated and ingrained, and you instruct your children when you're going about your daily lives. You go to a wonderful passage as Paul's writing his second letter to Timothy. Here's a young man who he is trying to prepare to go on without him. And he said to him in chapter 3 and verse 14, "But continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of," now listen carefully, "knowing of whom thou hast learned them, and that from a child thou hast known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus." From a child, the Greek word there's brephos, baby, infant. When is the time that you start teaching your children, instructing them? I know we have cradle roll classes, and I admire those wonderful women who are able to do that. I'll tell you what my wife did. She would read to our kids, she would talk to our kids, and she would try to provide for them that education from the very beginning of life. But you go to chapter 1 and verse 5, he says, "When I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois and in thy mother Eunice, and I am persuaded in thee also." You see, back in chapter 3, verse 14, he said, you know who you learned that from? And now he says you learned it from your mother and your grandmother. That's really what loving your children is to teach them from the time that they're very young. And you see, the whole book of Proverbs was written with that goal in mind. One of the things that I thought about doing and trying to plan this lesson was say, why don't you just go to the book of Proverbs and see what Solomon has to say about loving your children and your grandchildren. And you could base really a series of lessons on that if you wanted to. In chapter 1 and verse 5, and verse 2, and verse 8, he says, "To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive words of understanding." Chapter 1, verse 8, "My son, hear the instruction of your father, thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother." He's talking about what he was taught by both his mother and his father. What that tells us is that instruction is the obligation of parents and grandparents, by the way. In chapter 8, verse 33, "Hear instruction and be wise, and do not disdain it." Chapter 19 and verse 20, "Listen to counsel and receive instruction, that thou mayest be wise in thy latter days." Solomon is trying to say instruction, 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 training. That's what parents provide. And you could just go on. Young man growing up, how do you deal with a woman who is trying to allure you and tempt you? Don't go near her house. Don't go near the path that leads to her house. Avoid it. Pass it not by. When people come to you and says, "Hey, let's go do this together." You know, when friends get together and you get some bad friends and they start trying to get you to go along with them. "Hey, we'll all have one purse. We'll all do this together." Solomon says, don't do that. Don't listen to them. So much can be learned from that. This instruction not only would include our instructing our children in God's ways, but instructing them that it is their obligation to then train their children. Psalm 78, "Which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us." Now notice, that's been given to us. Verse 4, "We will not hide them from their children, showing the generation to come the praises of the Lord, and his strength and his wonderful works he has done. For he established testimony in Jacob and appointed law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that we should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them. What he is instructing is, we want to know them. We want to teach them to our children, but they've got to be given to that next generation as well, so that they don't forget God and they don't forget all of His works. You know, when you see your children train their children, that's when you can really start. That's when you appreciate being a grandparent, is when you know you've done enough to train your children to see them training their own children. But if you don't, you're almost guaranteeing their failure in life. In Psalm 32, verses 8 and 9, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. Be ye not as the horse or as the mule which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle, lest they come near unto thee. He said, you know, what do you want to do? Do you want to have your children to be led around like an old mule because you've not trained them? You're going to have somebody else. You know, when I read this, I think about the old mule, but I also think about how many children have not been trained properly and they end up in prison. Somebody else is having to guide them. Somebody else is having to take control of their life. Or Proverbs chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. His own shall die without instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. He shall die without instruction. Are you going to train your children? Are you going to give them instruction? Well, just like with the first one, I said, be a Manoah, be an Abraham. One of my favorite passages of the Old Testament is found in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. Oh, what a wonderful thought of a man like Abraham, who is so devout that he's going to train his family, that God can bring about what he intended to do with him. Number 3, to instill. Now, it's one thing to provide knowledge, but you also need to instill values in your children. Now, this is a little different, and this is something I hope that we will contemplate just a little bit here. Everyone has a value system, but our current generation is just really messed up with this idea that you let your children create their own set of values. I remember in 1982, Brother Thomas Warren called me on the telephone and he said, Brother Lawrence, I want you to write an article for me. I want you to write it on Values Clarification's View of Truth. And I remember responding to Brother Warren, I'm not sure I know what you're talking about. He said, well, do you have the book on Values Clarification? I said, no. He said, well, buy it and read it. And he said, then write the article. And for Spiritual Sword, and it appeared in the January 1983 edition of Spiritual Sword. And by the way, those two, the October and the January issues, if you don't have them, you ought to get those. Those are excellent articles on the subject of values clarification. There's a book written in 1972 by Simon, Howe, and Kirschenbach. It's called Values Clarification. And the idea of that book was meant primarily for teachers, to teach teachers how to tell children that there are no right answers, that you let the child decide for himself what he wants to believe and what he wants to have as his own system of values. There were 2 other books that were written about the same time that were of the same nature, called Teacher Effectiveness Training, and another one called Parent Effectiveness Training. Oh, boy, those books are going to be good. You know what they were? Don't tell your children they're wrong. Don't tell your children that they are making mistakes in life. Don't correct your children. Allow them to find their own set of values. You see, their view of truth is there is no truth, that everything is relative. Several years ago, there was a book written by Alan Bloom called The Closing of the American Mind. And the very first sentence in the very first chapter says, there's one thing a professor is absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering university believes or says that he believes that truth is relative. And by the way, that was written in 1988. Another generation has passed. Do you want to know why we have little kids who are going to school who say that I identify as a cat? And the schools have been putting litter boxes in closets. It's because they were taught no values at all. You just, anything you want to be, think you are, that's what you are. Proverbs 22 verse 15 says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will derive it far from him. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. If I were to ask you to reveal your most embarrassing thing that you did as a child, most of you would say, I believe I'm going to go out the back door. I don't want to tell what all I've done. Most of us would be incredibly embarrassed by that. Are you not thankful? I'll tell you one thing I did. When I was in church, my mother would bow her head in prayer, and I climbed under the pew, ran all the way up, and stood on the front podium during the middle of the prayer. Boy, I paid for that. You see, foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child, but a switch pulled out in front of the church building can make a huge difference in what that little boy will do again. Proverbs 29:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother, or his mother to shame. You see, if you turn a child loose and you don't instill values in them, which the world has not been doing, then there's going to be shame. Let me give you a good biblical example. When you go to 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6, you have David having gone through all of the trials and difficulties that he had with Absalom. Absalom's now dead. He's had the rebellion of Sheba, and it's been awful for him. And David's back in Jerusalem. He's already gone through this very terrible thing of numbering Israel and had to suffer the punishment for it. You get to chapter 1 of 1 Kings, and it says, and his father had not displeased him at any time in saying, why hast thou done so? And he also was a very goodly man, which means he was handsome. And his mother bare him after Absalom. Have any of y'all ever had kids that are just so cute? So cute that you never felt like you wanted to correct them? David did not correct Adonijah. And it says his father had not displeased him at any time. When you never displease your children, you're not doing your job. You've got to be willing to tell your children no from time to time. If parents do not instill values in their children, they'll do whatever they want to do. And it's just like in Judges chapter 21 and verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And what this do, it will end in death. There's a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And God will judge our children for this. Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 9 says, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let thy heart cheer thee all the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. Oh, you go out and do it, but you're going to stand in judgment. Be an Amram and a Jochebed, Moses' parents. When you go to Hebrews chapter 11, You have to pick up with verse 23. We often pick up with verse 24, but you need to pick up with verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a proper, goodly child. And they were not afraid of the king's commandment. Amram and Jochebed were good parents. They were not afraid of the king's command. What did they instill in Moses? By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. You know where he learned the value of standing up? Mama and Daddy. They showed what it means to instill values in children. Next is to inspire. You see, godly parents who really love their children want to inspire them to be the best that they can be. Maybe the better word is aspire, to teach them to aspire to be great. Not great necessarily in this world's eyes, but great in God's eyes. But let me tell you something that I have observed, what Paul writes to the Colossians in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21, where he says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, lest they be discouraged." Now, we often will read the portion to the Ephesians, but here he says, lest they be discouraged. It's one thing to practice real discipline with your family, but you have to allow them the ability to want to succeed in life. I've seen little children that have been so browbeat by their parents who were told that they were worthless, told that they were no good, that when you meet them, they rarely raise their heads because they're so discouraged. As parents and grandparents, we ought to not be discouraging them, but encouraging them to be what they can be. I love it when I see young people enthusiastic and wanting to serve the Lord. Children need praise when they do well. I realize in Romans 13, Paul's talking about the government. He said in verse 3, he says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Wilt thou not be afraid of the power? Not be afraid of the authority? Do what is good, and then thou shalt have praise from the same." The authority in the home, we ought to, when our children do good, find a way to praise that so that they understand we do care about them. We do have a love for them. There's actually a word for that. If you go to Ephesus, and I've enjoyed going to Ephesus more than once, and you go down the street, you come to a library called the Library of Celsus. It's a facade that's there from where the original library stood. And on the front of that facade are 4 statues. At the bottom of each of those statues is a one word: Sophia, wisdom; Arete, virtue; Episteme, knowledge; and Noia, the mind, the intellect. Those 4. And you think about a library. But that word arete is found in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 5. It says here, "And besides this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge." And then he continues on. We don't concentrate on that word virtue too much. If you look up the original word, that word arete, it carries with it the idea of moral excellence. It was used to describe, for instance, Plato would describe it as a man who was a good citizen. But to even understand the word a little bit more, if you had a saw that was real sharp and cut wood and did a good job of it, that's that word. Or if you had a hammer that was able to drive a nail and drive it good. Excellence. That's what that word arte means. When I go to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are honest, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things of good report, if there be any virtue, there's that word. If there's anything praiseworthy or praise, think on these things. Are there many things about which you can inspire your children? Just take that one verse right there and emphasize those great things. And there's some people who know how to do that. Some great encouragers in the Bible. Barnabas, I'm looking up the clock. I've got to go quickly now. Barnabas, you see him in Acts chapter 4 being called the son of consolation, the son of encouragement. You realize that later on they've gone on a missionary journey. Barnabas and Paul together, they carried with them John Mark. John Mark turned and went back at Perga and Pamphylia. And later on when it's time to go back, Barnabas wants to carry John Mark with him. Paul says, no, we don't need to take him. You get to Colossians 4 and verse 10, and he says, I want you to receive Mark. If he comes to you, he's good. 2 Timothy 4 verse 11, he says, bring him with you. He's useful to me for the ministry. You are making your children's future by the way you inspire them. Be a Naomi to a Ruth. You see, Naomi and her husband Elimelech went over into Moab. Things were bad, so they had to go over there, and the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they found them wives over there. After Elimelech and the two boys died, it's time for Naomi to go back to her people. She's willing to leave Orpah and Ruth there, but Ruth wants to go with her. What does Naomi do? She gets back and she realizes there's a good man there, Boaz. He's a near kinsman. Ruth chapter 3 verse 1 says, Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee? I want to make sure things go good for you. I want to inspire you to be the best that you can be, that your life will be successful. Then to imitate. Parents, you've got to be worthy of imitation. Children are going to look at you. They're going to do what you do. In the book of Ezekiel 16, verse 44, the latter part of that proverb says, As the mother, so is the daughter. Or Acts 7, verse 51, Stephen said, As your fathers did, so do ye. You're doing the same things they did. You will see children mimic what their parents do. Little girls will get in there, try to put on an apron, try to stir up stuff in a bowl like she's been like mama. Boys will go out and they'll try to get a little hammer. They want to be like daddy. Children will imitate you. When you read in Genesis 12 and Genesis 20 about Abraham lying about his wife, guess what happens in Genesis 26? Isaac does the same thing. There's a poem written by Edgar Guest. I guess he's my favorite poet, at least for today. You've probably heard the poem, I'd rather see a sermon. He says, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one should walk with me than merely tell me the way. The eye's a better pupil and more willing than the ear. Fine counseling is confusing, but example is always clear. And the best of all the preachers are men who live their creeds, for to see good put in action is what everybody needs. I can learn to do it if you will let me see it done. I can watch your hands in action, but your tongue too fast may run. And the lecture you deliver may be very wise and true, but I'd rather get my lessons by observing what you do. For I might understand you and the high advice you give, but there's no misunderstanding of how you act and how you live. When I see a deed of kindness, I'm eager to be kind. When a weaker brother stumbles and a strong man stays behind, just to see if he can help him, then the wish grows strong in me to become as big and as thoughtful as I know that friend to be. And all the travelers can witness that the best of guides today is not the one who tells them, but the one who shows them the way. One good man teaches many. Men believe what they behold. One deed of kindness noticed is worth 40 that are told. Who stands with men of honor learns to hold his honor dear, for right living speaks a language which is to everyone is clear. Though an able speaker charms me with his eloquence, I say, I'd rather see a sermon than to hear one any day. Be a Eunice and a Lois. Be the one who models that. Again, going back, when I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois and in thy mother Eunice, and I am persuaded in thee also. True love does not always give children what they want. It gives them what they need. And I will tell you, this type of love is often mistaken in youth, but it can be appreciated in maturity. I can tell you all those little switches that came off of the tree in front of the Bethel Church of Christ in Vernon, Alabama. I didn't really appreciate those at the time. And actually, I probably thought my mama was a mean woman. But you know, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11, no chastening for the present seems to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yields a peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them that have been exercised thereby. I am thankful. I am blessed that I had a mother and a father who loved me and grandparents who loved me and who allowed me to be able to have the training that brought me to today. And that's the kind of love that our nations need to hear today.